not less, to reconcile these splits. And that's why he set up the Muslim College, which is the best higher education institution for Muslims in Britain. Although there's some other stuff going on in Cambridge and things. But sadly, he's no longer with us, but I'm sure from the heaven worlds he's helping. Yeah, so let's have more philosophy. And I think, as I said earlier, that the revision of the concept of the Holy Spirit I'm proposing would make it much more possible to have a really profound sharing of ideas at an existential level between philosophers from, whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Druid, whatever tradition you're from, Zoroastrian, etc. I noted, by the way, that I saw on a news flash just before I came, the president of Iran has possibly, a helicopter he was travelling in has crashed. He might have died or be injured. I think that's very sad, because within the Iranian perspective, there's tremendous intellectual work going on, philosophically, and the sort of anti-Iranian rhetoric that one sees in certain circles is hysterical nonsense. And they're like all countries. There's tensions within, but anyway, I hope that chap is all right. And if he's gone and died, then it's sad, and commiserations on his family. But we all eventually go back to God, as the Quran reminds us, virtually on every other page. One of the most interesting things the Quran says, and I've done a detailed commentary line by line on it, is Muhammad says, or the Quran says through him, you want to dispute about this, you don't agree with that, you say I'm wrong about this, you say you're right about this. Look, the matter is only known by God, and unto him I defer. We won't know till the authority of the divine intelligence explains it to us, because here we don't know. So I think and that to me is the essence of philosophy. So Muhammad, bless him, in the Quran says it's okay to philosophize. We don't know. We can try and work it out together as much as possible, but ultimately only the ultimate, the absolute, knows the full story. We'll wait till we get further updates. Or, what John Hick called the eschatological verification, which is when you die, you get, you have an audience, apparently. Right. Now, I'm going to move on to Marxism now. That's the Islamic one, which is fascinating. I could talk all day about it.
May I ask one question?
Yeah, sure.
I'm surprised about philosophic Islam. You didn't mention politics. And in the Christianity, we have a kind of, we look to the world, but we are not from the world. So there is a kind of distance. And Jesus was not a politician. But I thought that in the Islamic tradition, there is the organization of the society. So I was wondering, especially nowadays, how these Islam philosophers, they speak or not about politics.
Well, that's a really brilliant question. Of course, yes, the answer is yes. There's a long tradition of discourse about politics, although the word is a Greek word. I mean, the word in Islam is the community, the ummah. So Islam is not just for yourself, it's for the community. It's for your family, it's for your neighbours. And how the ummah should govern its affairs is important in Islam. In fact, it's a sad thing that Muhammad died a bit early. Most people don't realise he was actually poisoned. And he died very early, in his early 60s. I think before he had a chance to really bed down the politics of all this. And because he died early, he left things in an unsettled state. It's a tragedy, it's a catastrophe, what happened. Because in his household there was quarrelling going on. His closest friend, disciple, was called Ali, his son-in-law, who was married to his beloved daughter Fatima, the fruit of his beautiful love relationship with Khadija, his long-term partner and wife. And it seems that he intended Ali to succeed him. He said so in public on a couple of occasions. He stopped the caravan and said, "This is my successor, Ali." You can't be more specific than that. But because he died, he didn't write it down. It wasn't like a written will or anything. And so when he died early, prematurely, and suddenly, he got sick and died very quickly. The Mafia muscled in. Now, what I mean by Mafia is the gangsters, the robber barons, the warlords, the people that saw, hey, this movement's really cool. We can go and raid Damascus and get all their gold, and we can say we're doing it in the name of Islam. We'll set up Islam Inc. We can get slave girls there. We can get slaves. We can tax them, and they saw Islam as a chance to get rich and conquer people, and make profits. Which is just, this is the problem with human beings. We think like gangsters. And so and unfortunately you had 3 caliphs appointed, and they made a decision not to recognise Ali and not to accept the succession was designated, because Ali was undoubtedly the one that knew most about the origin of the Quran, what it meant, what Muhammad really wanted for humanity, what kind of a community he was leaving. He should have been the successor, but the businessmen took over, and they voted among themselves to appoint one of them, not Ali. He was regarded as too mystical, no, he's not a businessman, he's not one of us. It's like bankers in the City of London. They wouldn't appoint me as chairman of the board. I'm a philosopher, I'm not a banker. So they appointed like banker types. And they did that 3 times running. And that's when Islam as a war business started. They instituted the idea of the holy war. It's fine to go and conquer these people. Yes, tax them. If they don't follow it this way, even if they're Muslims, but they're not the right kind of Muslims, you can attack them too. They invented this whole nonsense. So by the time the 4th caliph was chosen, finally they decided, okay, we'll give Ali a chance. They voted him as caliph. But by then it was too late, because the warlords had embedded this other idea of Islam as sort of as a mafia business too deeply. Ali tried to stop it. He tried to rein it all in. He lived very simply. He stopped living in great palaces and having slave girls. He tried to say, no, that's not what Islam's about. He was working on a chronological version of the Quran. He was a scholar. He was literate. He loved the Quran. The warlords had appointed people as governors in different parts of Damascus and elsewhere. They refused to accept Ali's rulership, and they rebelled against him. And eventually they killed him and all his family. They killed his children. They tried to exterminate the entire line. Not just they weren't very nice. And they did this in the name of Islam. So you see, if Muhammad had been alive, watching all this, he would have been utterly, utterly appalled. So that's what we're up against with the politics of Islam. And it's been like that ever since, because that's the split between the Shias, who follow Ali, and they came into power later. They finally, carved out independence in Persia, which follows these teachings as the Shia traditions. And they say that Ali's wisdom was handed down to a succession of imams spiritual elders, and there are 12 of them. And they've guarded their words, they've written down everything they said, they gave commentaries on the Quran, and they were inspired geniuses, spiritual geniuses. One of them was this chap, Jafar as-Sadiq, who I mentioned. He was, I think, the 6th of the Imamic lineage. And he said, I don't want to do politics. He stayed in Mecca and Medina just teaching, doing what I do, philosophy classes. And so nobody bothered to kill him. If any of these people sort of rose above the parapet and said, hey, I'm the Imam, whatever, then they were killed off or poisoned by the warlords. So, in a sense, Islam is like a one long train crash tragedy. The split between spirit, the inspired people, sometimes they call themselves Sufis, sometimes philosophers, and the kind of warlords, who are the gangsters, who are just, it's for profit and money and wealth and power and status. And that struggle's been, going on to the present day. I mean, yes, I'm on the side of the philosophers. So, I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Yes, sir.
Does it? Okay. It's a long one. We could go on further, but let me turn to Marxism because it's interesting, and that has a similar story, actually. So I just want to make a confession here that I was brought up to think Marxism was the truth. When I asked my mother, who was a French teacher and a Savon University graduate, she'd become interested in Marxism during World War II. She was inspired by the heroic solidarity between Russia and the Allies and America, that heroic struggle. She'd met people who were in the French resistance, a lot of them were communists, and she had joined the Communist Party because to her that was true. It was the struggle against Nazism and evil and all that. And so she never grew out of that faith. She kept that faith to the end of her life. But it became moderated as she grew older. Eileen. And I think in the 70s, she was very happy with this idea of the coexistence between the Marxist bloc, communist world, and the capitalist world. Her main focus was on peace. She wasn't a Marxist scholar. She never sort of, but she was friends with quite a few Marxist intellectuals. Istvan Metsaros, who was professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, who wrote about Lukács and, the dialectic, detailed Marxist philosophy, was a very close friend of hers. She was moving in circles with Marxist intellectuals. And so when I went off to study philosophy at university, I think she just assumed I would become a Marxist, because it was true, right? My problem is that I'd already started studying Eastern religions and metaphysics and what Marxists dismiss as mysticism, and I was already too polymathic to fit snugly into a box called Marxism, and then because I chose to read history at the University of London, and I did detailed work on the history of Russia and Eastern Europe and the history of communism and the revolution, I read Solzhenitsyn and I discovered the crimes of Stalin, which I had to write essays on and study, the Gulag and all that. And I just was appalled at what had been done in the name of Marxism. Now we're into the mid-80s here. And I went to my mother and said, Mum, look, do you know about all this stuff? Have you ever read Solzhenitsyn? Do you know about the Gulag? And she said to me, Thomas, I don't have time for that. I won't read that stuff. Now, I find that a betrayal, as much as I love my mother, that is a tragedy. That is a betrayal of the truth, because, and so many people were like that. They couldn't believe this stuff was really true. They couldn't believe Stalin had been this kind of monster because she was brought up to think he was the hero, the great saviour of Europe, But the more I read into it and studied it I realised that wasn't true. Then in 1990, I went to Moscow for the first time to a conference of philosophers for peace. I was then doing my PhD in the history of the search for peace since World War II, right? And I was really bowled over by the quality of Russian intellectuals I met, philosophers who worked at the Institute of Philosophy in Moscow. And this was in the time of Gorbachev, and they were saying, in the conference, they were saying, well, I used to be a Marxist. I'm not sure anymore. I think I'm a post-Marxist. These genius intellectuals of Russian origin who became good friends of mine were saying, I'm certainly not a Stalinist, because the crimes of Stalin were now known and they were being revealed to the world and to Russians. And you could say that freely in Russia at that time, in the early 90s. And I met some incredible intellectuals who elected me coordinator of Philosophers of Peace worldwide, which I took, as a great honour and responsibility. To me, so the one really interesting and intelligent thing my mother said to me, well, she said many things, but one was, Marxism isn't a sort of ism. It's not a package, it's a method. It's a scientific method for studying history and society. It's an educational hypothesis. Take it as that, Thomas. Find what's useful in it and discard what's not. So, in that respect, I fast forward now. I mean, I have read, pretty much all of Marx, and not only that, but I'm doing a commentary which has taken a few years on his great work, Das Kapital, a detailed commentary. And there's much in it that is very, very interesting. And as an intellectual historian, I've studied the origins of Marxist thought. So I've looked at the life story of Marx. I've read many biographies of him, what inspired him, and also Engels, his working partner, close friend, and their circle of friends. I mean, Marx grew up in the Rhineland, originally in Trier, where he was born, which was liberated by Napoleon from the Prussians. It was absorbed into the Napoleonic French-speaking world. And Marx grew up as a young man revering French Enlightenment thought. His father, who was a lawyer, was a lover of French literature, Voltaire, the Enlightenment. And although Jewish by origin, wore it very lightly. So much so that he actually, because you couldn't practice as a lawyer, after Prussia conquered that area and took it over when Napoleon fell, only Christians could work in the law. So the father said, well, to hell with it, I'm a Christian, and was baptised as a Lutheran, and had young Karl baptised as well, because it's just like a stamp that you're okay, So he was an enlightened thinker, and Marx grew up to revere that whole tradition of French intellectual thought, that we humans are entitled to work out what reality is. We don't have to accept it from a sacred text, be it the Quran, the Bible, whether the Jewish or Christian version or anything. We can use our reason. So that faith in reason was very deep in Marx. As a young man, he went to university to find out what is truth, like I did. He went to the University of Berlin. He didn't meet Hegel. He died before he got there, but he met people who'd known Hegel. And he decided that Hegel was the genius he was looking for. And he read his works, and he adopted what he called the dialectic method from Hegel. His dad was disappointed. He wanted him to study law and get a good job and have a good income, and But old Marx, who was supposed to be studying law, was always going off to the philosophy classes. And in the end, he shifted and studied philosophy. It's really frustrating. I wish I'd been Marx's teacher, because he wasn't sufficiently grounded in the wholeness of philosophy. He went on his own little track too early. He didn't have a mastery of the whole unfolding of philosophy, and he had absolutely zero knowledge of other philosophical traditions like Islamic philosophy, the whole thing I was talking about, no knowledge whatsoever. The same, and ironically, the same even with Jewish philosophy. So far as I can work out, he never studied the great Jewish philosophers like Maimonides. He never studied the Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mystical tradition, which would have taught him a bit more humility before the divine intelligence. Instead, he stuck in his adolescent reason's going to work it all out. And his adoption of French materialism became his sort of leitmotif. And this was a problem because he was an undoubted genius. I mean, a polymath. He learned many languages. He was a master of many things. He was very good at mathematics. And then he self-taught himself economics. He decided that Hegel was great, but too airy-fairy, and that the problems with the world have to be sorted out by economics, because the poverty of the immense masses of people caused by the Industrial Revolution, industry should be fine. Like, there's loads of, we now can make stuff, we have energy from steam and coal, and yet it's only the capitalists are benefiting. So there's something wrong here. We need to rethink economics so that everybody shares the cake. And he came up with his theories of communism, which he explained in his voluminous works. You know, there were flashes of genius in all that, but, as I said, the greatest lacuna in Marx, which I've pinpointed in my critique of him, was the lack of any metaphysical and ethical substratum to his theories. He seemed to think, because of his somewhat shallow adoption of French materialism, that the laws of history unfolding will produce utopia as much as if I boil a kettle, the steam will come out. You know, it's natural. So he's just assuming human goodness as a given, and he's assuming that history will lead naturally to the communist utopia that we all want. But we're going to get there without any need for any metaphysics, like any kind of God or spirit, no Holy Spirit for him. And we're going to get there without any kind of ethics. What? Like, what? If he'd have given that to me as his teacher in an essay, I would have failed him, you know, because you can't get to a better world without both metaphysics and ethics. You just can't do it, as philosophers have realised centuries ago, millennia ago. So I think he was seduced by the scientism of his day. They really did think that the world is like a machine, and if you put in, you know,
Yes.
something this end,
Interesting.
it'll come round and out, you'll get utopia that end. I think he was seduced by, it wasn't just him, it was they were discovering magnetism and gravity had laws and it's all mathematical, and Newton, he loved Darwin, because Darwin seemed to explain the whole of evolution in naturalistic, materialist terms. He dedicated Das Kapital to Darwin, who he never met, but he revered him for providing an explanation for life which doesn't involve either ethics or metaphysics. And so I think, okay, why does all that matter? Well, why it matters is because when the communists came into power in Russia, in Lenin's coup, and in China with Mao's coup, they enacted the most brutal and savage and violent dictatorship that's ever been known in history. And that's a hell of a statement to make, but it's true. As a historian, I can say that. In the name of doing good, Lenin said, we will use violence and terror against the middle class and the bourgeoisie and the aristocrats. We will do it in the name of the dictatorship and the proletariat.
Yeah, it's efficiency.
And so Lenin, you know, said that in writing. I mean, he knew what he was doing. And if you opposed it and you went to Lenin and said, you know, you're reading Marx wrong, he didn't mean to shoot everybody, then he would have shot you. You know, Although I tell a lie, because at one point Lenin let the philosophical dissidents leave Russia on a ship. It's a famous moment in history when a bunch of intellectuals who were true freedom thinkers like me, they'd all complained, and Lenin let them all go. He said, okay, go on.
Bye-bye.
If you want to be bourgeois, don't stay and build our perfect state. But everyone else that stays here, you have to stick by the rules and follow the laws, and if you don't, we shoot you. Lenin started that. And so anyway, I just want to share something. I've been reading this week. There was a very brilliant Marxist called Karl Kautsky, who was an Austrian Marxist, who'd known Engels very closely, worked with him in London, translating works together. And I don't think he met Marx, but he certainly, Engels would have told him everything, about what the inner workings of the mind of the genius were. And when Kautsky saw what Lenin was doing in Russia, he was a leader in the Social Democrat Party in Austria and Germany. He wrote a pamphlet saying, this is not communism, this is not Marxism. What Lenin is doing is worse than what it's claiming to replace. He's killing everybody with mass terror. That's not what Marx or Engels wanted. They wanted the gradual transformation of the economic conditions of the poor, the working class, through legislation, through consciousness raising, and ultimately, yes, a total transformation of society, but through our own will and our collective efforts, ideally non-violently as much as possible. What Kautsky said is that World War I created all this monster because it brutalized everybody. The Russian peasants were starving. They were brutalized by the war. They learned how to shoot guns. And Lenin sort of lit the fuse, which let the mob run amok in Russia. And the terror that was then unleashed was as a result of the trauma of World War I. That's what Kautsky said. Very brilliant critique of Lenin's terrorism. And Trotsky's, by the way. He said Trotsky's just as bad. Well, their response was, Trotsky wrote a book called Terrorism and Communism, in which he attacked Kautsky and said, you're just a namby-pamby liberal. We're the real revolutionaries. You can't have a revolution without terror and without violence. And we're doing it. So go and bleat somewhere else, But Kautsky stuck to his critique, and I agree with his critique of this terrorism that was unleashed by Lenin and Trotsky and then was perfected by Stalin, is the most horrendous thing that I can report as a historian has ever happened in history. It's a catastrophic error. So what happened was, if you were a dissenter under Stalin's rule of any kind, you just had to criticize the leader. You were hauled off into a system of prison camps called the Gulag, and you could be locked away for 5, 10, 20, 30 years for just nothing, for just speaking, for thinking, actually. If you did worse things like stole something from the state, again, that was a prison sentence. But you would also just be shot if you were a serious threat. And I've been reading up the history of the Gulag because I was inspired by my dear colleagues Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman's bicycle trip down the road of Bones to Magadan across Siberia, which I watched recently. And it was just very moving to think that the Gulag victims in that far end of Russia, who were in the region called Kolyma, their bones were literally put into the road, that's why it's called the Road of Bones, to get to Magadan by Stalin. If you died, no problem, we'll just use the bones and make the road. And so I've been revisiting the work by Robert Conquest called Kolyma, which tells the story of this far end of Siberia where there was gold. And Stalin wanted gold to buy stuff for his electrification engineering projects in European Russia. And so he sent dissenters down the gold mines, and they had to work in sub-freezing conditions with hardly any clothes, and they died by the tens of thousands. Worked them for 6 months and then they died. So it was just like the camps of Nazi Germany. Only, I mean, historians agree more people died in the Gulag than did in Nazi Germany. And any dissent was crushed, Well, as a free-thinking philosopher, I mean, countless philosophers perished in that. Many of the old guard communists, the idealist communists, friends of Lenin, they perished. Stalin was a merciless destroyer of, he called them idealists. There were people trying to reconcile Buddhism and Marxism, which is something I've looked at. I think it can be done. Because Marxism lacks an ethics and a metaphysics, well, Buddhism has both, so join them up, please. But Stalin got a whiff of this and killed them all. Communist intellectuals at a high level, including his head of cryptography, were shot. So really it's a monstrous thing that was created. And then he then gave the atomic bomb to Mao Zedong and funded and supported the birth of the Chinese communist system. And Mao then enacted mass killing on the Chinese people in the Stalinist style. Mass famines, torture, suppression. Just read an in-depth biography of Mao or Stalin and what happened in China and Russia, and you'll know what I'm telling is the truth. So fast forward, now we come to modern times, we have Putin in power in Russia. And Putin was a KGB member who revered Stalin. The intelligence circles of the GRU and the KGB and all that, they were not allowed to do other than follow the leader. They did all the mass killings without any conscience whatsoever. They were the brutal extermination machine that ran the camps, arrested dissidents, people that had a brain, and they killed them. Putin wants to go back to those days. Just hear me. This is really, really important. He literally wants to go back to those days. He has now made it a crime to mention all this stuff. You're not allowed to talk in Russia about what I'm saying, the Gulag, the crimes. It's an offence against the state. So, to speak the truth is an offence against the state? Yes. Well, what does that tell us about that state? It tells us that Putin is literally wanting to go back to the good old days of Stalin. So, I listened to a very important talking book about the knowledge of the Gulag after Gorbachev. For the first time, scientific researchers could get into the archives. They were trying to figure out how many people had died. What had happened to Wallenberg, a great Swedish diplomat in Hungary, who'd rescued lots of Jews during the Holocaust from the Nazis. When the Soviets attacked and conquered Hungary, within a few days they'd arrested him. An independent Swedish diplomat who should have had immunity went into the Gulag. Why would the Russians capture this great hero, right? And he vanished without trace. So the book starts with nowadays, 1980s, people trying to trace where did Wallenberg die? Where's his grave? Was he killed? Is there any papers on this? And still to this day we haven't found out. This guy vanished like millions and millions of people into the Gulag. And one of the things the book says is, this is true for millions of people in Russia.